for being here tonight. Thank you to Turki and Abdel from Bricklab, coming from Saudi Arabia, to talk about your practice. Thank you, Paul Bouet, coming from Paris, to talk about your research. And thank you also, Alia Bengana, for the moderation and the discussion that we'll have tonight. It's a lecture organized in the context of this exhibition on André Corboz. And André Corboz had a very non-conventional way to look at history and territory. And so we are interested to see, also in your work, how you see now this question of the heritage, the history and the territory. And I will pass the microphone to Alia to present our guest tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, Abdulrahman and Turki for coming here to EPFL. So I will try briefly to introduce you. I will start with Abdulrahman and Turki, who are two brothers. Both were born and raised in Jeddah. Abdulrahman graduated from the University of West England, Bristol, with bachelor degree in architecture and planning. And Turki graduated from McGill University in Montreal, Canada, with master's degree in history and theory of architecture. So together, they founded Bricklab in 2015. So their practice is really probes boundary between art, material research, and the built environments, merging technical mastery with conceptual rigor and interdisciplinary design, inviting reflection upon dynamic elements that often go unnoticed. They explore the gaps between graphics, project design, interiors, and architecture through innovative investigation of site, object, and user, the component parts of our social and physical world. Bricklab creates architecture for cultural users, visionary master plans, public spaces, interventions, exhibition scenography, and artistic installation in response to the sociopolitical and economic context of their commissions. So their work have been exhibited internationally at the Venice Biennale, at Lisbon, Seoul Biennale for Architecture and Urbanism, and Salon de Montpellier. Thank you very much for being here. So Paul Bouet is French and a senior lecturer in history and architecture, culture at the École d'Architecture de la Ville des Territoires at Marne-la-Vallée, Paris-Est. He holds a master's degree in architecture from another architecture school called Palimpseste, 2012, and a master's degree in the history of science and technology from EHESS in 2017. He got his doctorate in architecture in 2022 at the University of EPFL, and actually he works at the École d'Architecture de la Ville des Territoires, and he teaches history of architecture, urban planning, and the environment, as well as supervising research theses. So his research aims to reread the history of the 20th century and the 21st century of architecture through the prism of environmental issues. He studies the way in which concerns about energy, climate, material, matter, and the living world have continued to challenge the art of building throughout the industrial period. He is particularly interested in the history of theory, on the adaptation of buildings to the climate, research on material and energy conservation, the circulation of techniques and knowledge in colonial and post-colonial contexts, and the aesthetics of the environmental control devices. In his doctoral thesis, he retraced the history of research into the use of solar energy in the post-World War II architecture, in connection with the processes of decolonization and the emergence of ecologism. In his current research, he is studying the French attempt to construct air-conditioned buildings and cities in the Sahara Desert in Algeria to extract oil and gas during the Algerian War of Independence in between 1954 and 1962. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Turki. I'm Turki, and this is my brother Abdulrahman. We're partners that started BricklAb in 2015. Our practice is a small practice. We basically try to really pursue projects that are interesting for us in terms of understanding space, understanding our cities, and more importantly, understanding the idea of place and territory. Our projects really have a wide range, so we work on installations, site-specific installations, interiors, architecture, and restoration projects. Our investigations on the idea of place really take on multiple different formats, so on one strand of research, we looked at we come from Saudi Arabia, and obviously Saudi Arabia is very famous for its desert environment. So we worked on a couple of projects where we try to understand the character of a certain location or certain place by distilling the color of the sand in that location. So we worked on the right, these are projects from the desert in Arabia, and on the left, these are different beaches along the west coast of Saudi to try to extract the material palette related to the place. We also we're very experimental in this approach, so we also work with silicone, and we try to create prints from different locations around the city, sort of capture a texture that is at once very familiar, very banal, but very specific to a specific locale.
I think it's really, we do talk about Saudi in general, but we come from a very small city, which is Jeddah. It's by the coast. Sand is a place that comes from, it's close to the sea. So for us, it's a coastal city where the architecture has thrived through people coming into the sea. Pilgrims come into Jeddah, and that really reinforced the city to become the place that it is. For us, we have, as Alia has briefly told us a little bit about us, we have studied in different places, came back to Jeddah with a fresh perspective, and started noticing the architecture around us. That really gave us something. It made us start noticing the city in different ways. So we started exploring the city, starting noticing bits and pieces of the architecture around us, starting noticing modern architecture. The spirit of the place started taking shape from our perspective in ways that went against the grain of what this sort of new hot topic of what Saudi is at the current moment in time. It's being rebranded, it's being placed on the map as a kind of a new state that's becoming more and more Saudi in a way. How do we brand our cities? And this is something that's more on a global scale. Even kind of when we first came here to EPFL, it's kind of a combination of these different buildings, what's old, what's new, and we do a lot of residencies in different places. Every time we meet architects, it's about what is this new architecture? What about the identities of buildings, modern buildings that exist within the very fabric of our cities? How do we kind of redefine the heritage of our cities through the existing architecture that defines our cities? And that kind of brought us into looking at archiving different bits of architectures or different types of documents that we found. Again, kind of just to give you a little bit of perspective, I think what you have here is quite unique, or maybe what you have here is quite particular within the wider context of your archival material or archival data is quite easy to access. In Jeddah, it's really hard. You have to actually meet people and try to find this. We actually found a person who collects these documents. So these are documents that we've scanned, and I think maybe what we eventually ended up creating, as part of Bricklab, we created this initiative that we call Saudi Modern. So it's kind of a fun way to kind of play against what the newspapers used to call. So we ended up, it was like a branding thing that ended up being an exhibition that we'll talk through a bunch of these things. But it's a wider archival collective where we really wanted to have a louder voice to get funded, get more people to help us archive things, try to save buildings. Jeddah went through a massive array of demolitions where it was something that was larger than us. There are people saying that these buildings of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s have no historical significance whatsoever because everything that had any significance was only made out of coral stone or something that was a heritage building of a very particular era of the past, which was kind of, if you think of, which I would imagine Paul might touch upon eventually, is this kind of mud brick building, which is kind of this very, very particular way of saying what is a historical building in a niche sort of history that I guess in the Arab region is more identified, is something that's more of a pastiche, I would say. I think maybe in Turkey you should talk a little bit more because I've been talking for a while.
For us, the kind of starting point was really about this was the oil concessions signing that happened in the 1930s, and from that point on, the built environment in Saudi radically transformed over the coming decades. And unfortunately, most of this early period of modernization was always set aside as something that is inauthentic or does not relate to the place or extremely foreign. But from our perspective, we were born into a modern city and we grew up in a modern city. So we need to understand what was happening over those decades following the discovery of oil. So we started collecting all of these archival materials. We had the chance to meet the master planner who was appointed by the United Nations in the 50s to plan Jeddah and extracted a lot of information from him. One of his surveys that he completed in the late 50s, early 60s. And that kind of gave us a good picture of what the city looked like.
And so these are his original drawings, and then we digitized these drawings in efforts to kind of make this available, hopefully in the near future, to create a database that's available for students, researchers alike.
And for us, it's really crazy to see that from the 1960s until today, the city really expanded. So the blue part is what it looked like in 1962, and then this is what it looks like today. So we started to dig up visiting buildings, taking that kind of methodology of exploring the city, but actually trying to find more, I don't want to say landmarks, but significant buildings from that period.
Just buildings of interest, really. This is an extract from the book that we created with an exhibition that took place in this house. So the grander scheme of the exhibition took place in that house. It's called Family House, who were one of our funders. They gave us the house that we restored. It's a 1950s house.
So they were planning on demolishing the villa. It was one of the first villas in one of the first suburbs outside of the old walled city. And when we came with the idea, they said, okay, maybe let's rethink demolishing the house and turn it into a cultural institute. And it was fortunate for us because we had the chance to hold the exhibition inside.
So it was a simple way for us to come into the house, restore it, try to save the house. They actually wanted to demolish the house. So they said, you can use it, we're going to demolish it after they saw the exhibition. We were like, hey, we're going to keep the house and reuse it for other purposes. So all we did was a simple overlay of these walls onto the existing structure of the house. We just put in these archival materials. People really liked it, and they kind of gained this insight about it and really would save a few buildings during these past demolitions. So this kind of gives you an idea about, so this kind of shows you, so from from this balcony, you can see what the city looked like about 2 years ago. And that's what it looks like now. So these were literally the surrounding buildings around that very house.
So it was a very kind of a very pivotal moment in the city's history, and I think we were fortunate to have actually worked on this archival material and did this exhibition because less than a year after this mass demolition started to happen, these were all being informal settlements, and they were being cleared for future development. So the identity and the character of the city is really at stake here.
And I mean, I think these are just how did we expand? It's just to show how do we expand the research a little bit more in different methods and different means, taking old maps that were generated for the city. We used this for the Islamic Arts Biennale to create an arts map for the city, which was again archival for us. So we took that map, scanned it, started overlaying it with new material, just to kind of question how do we generate maps for our cities using archival maps as a way to kind of reuse maps as well as we can reuse buildings. So it's kind of these small kind of hints and gestures of how can we have fun with these things. You can use graphics as gestures towards architecture and urban plans.
And some of the so our research really has taken on different forms over the past 2 years as well. Some buildings that really hold a very significant part of our cultural heritage were being explored and then expanded on for different installations and exhibitions. So this is the Pilgrims Accommodation Building. So this was where pilgrims, first arrived by plane, and they would stay in this series of housing blocks. So it was a very vibrant marketplace. People would come here throughout the year. You have pilgrims that exchange goods on the grounds of these buildings, and unfortunately, these buildings are most of them are already demolished by now. Yeah. So in an attempt to really capture what these buildings meant for the city, and also try to persuade government officials to reconsider these demolitions, we worked with Sumaya Vali, the curator of the Islamic Biennale, to develop an installation that actually works with extracting materials from the demolition site and reinstalling them in the later Hajj terminal. So this is in the SOM tented Hajj terminal, which was built in the 80s. And we wanted to superimpose that moment in the 50s under this canopy, just to sort of communicate this tradition of receiving pilgrims and accommodating them on their way to Mecca.
So it was really fun because it's a one-to-one reconstruction of parts of that building while we were able to go into the demolition site and collect different materials. So we were able to collect doors, we were able to collect keys, we were able to collect documents, and that will later on go into a larger spectrum of archival data that we can showcase at a later time. So we kind of use exhibitions and, art exhibitions or design biennales or different formats as vehicles for us to keep collecting these data or forms of archival materials to maybe showcase it in another Saudi modern exhibition. So we spoke to you briefly about Saudi modern, but we intend to have more and more Saudi modern exhibitions to showcase these different things, but we use our architecture projects in our practice, we use other opportunities in our practice to kind of put things in our cabinet of curiosities that we can show later on in different forms of exhibitions, or share these different forms of research with other practitioners at some point in time.
It's always a challenge because there's not a lot of value that's placed on these buildings or this part of our heritage. Because when we were extracting parts of this building, we were literally on the demolition site trying to haggle with the demolition contractor to give us access to the site when no one is looking and give us pieces of the building.
And of course, we weren't allowed to go inside, so this was all kind of
And they were all just,
in the shadows.
they were all just thinking, why do these guys want garbage? And why is it important for them? They still don't understand. But I think that when it's properly, documented and presented, it really becomes part of the collective history of the city. And then we also, we also engaged with heritage buildings. So this is a traditional a coral limestone building in old Caravanserai in the old city of Jeddah. And what we really wanted to do with this installation is to demonstrate that heritage buildings can also speak to a contemporary audience. And this was part of an exhibition in 2017. And what we did with these interventions is to really show that these highlight some of the traditional architectural motifs, but also add very contemporary content. So we have in the back a work by Ali Kazma. This is the seed bank in Norway. And we also collected plants from different plant vendors across the city and turned each room into a small little garden.
But we gained plans for this building. We did a site cleanup. We were able to bring in water and electricity into the building. And we're able to meet a lot of people who were in and around the area. So there's a lot of kind of human interactions as well as a lot of architectural interactions as well as interactions with the owners of that site. Which I think is quite particularly interesting and to kind of gain a lot of knowledge into this. And I think these are just kind of small backdrops of how our practice kind of operates. Again, in a similar way, the same thing with the Venice Architecture Biennale. We collected so much data, met so many people when we worked in Venice Architecture Biennale. You have to put this project to tell them about it.
And I think it just takes us a bit back to this kind of two different strands of research that we've been doing to understand this idea of place. For this installation at the Saudi Pavilion, we worked with a mixture of resin and sand as a sort of symbolic material that references the landscape of Saudi, but we also overlaid that with archival plans and images that show how our cities expanded over time, and to give the visitor a kind of full circle understanding of how we create, how territory was created in Saudi.
Yeah, and I think lastly, to kind of just give you another scale of our research is to kind of looking at identities of our cities, going into a much smaller scale. We look at glass or these glass motifs in these buildings in the areas of demolition. We recently did a residency in ZKU in Berlin, and we were looking at these two different types of glass. We found glass on the left, which was found in Berlin, and the glass on the right, which was found in Jeddah. So looking at parallels, how can we kind of start resonating things in a kind of global conversation or global discourse. The building on the left is obviously a building that's, I don't recall if it's demolished yet or not in Jeddah, but anyway, how do we create these things and how can we start generating different forms for just pure research with color? The glass from the top is with people that I was just talking to you about, say, glass. They gave us these bits of glass and we kind of looked through, very inspired with the colors of the glass, generated these forms of just kind of changing the form of this, tracing these, creating, if we CNC, was it CNC? It was laser cut. It's multiple layers of creating these casts all the way into a sculptural piece. And then seeing how can we question these identities, how can we create products out of them, how can we create a larger conversation with a wider audience, and where can that lead to? And I think that kind of loops back into questioning where does what are the boundaries between different scales of architecture lead, and how can we find different methods of research? Can we keep that question open? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will listen to Paul and this question and discussion after.
So, good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank first Cyril for this invitation and the Archizoom staff for the organization, Alia also for the moderation, my co-panelists for their work. I also see there were links in terms of desert materials, link between the past and what we can learn from this. And I'm presenting in the context of this exhibition on André Corboz. I must say that I don't know much about him, and I know his work mainly through Sébastien Marot, with who I did my PhD, and Sébastien often borrows to Corboz concepts such as palimpseste or hypertext, and I believe, as I was telling Cyril, that both also share an incredible curiosity and a true art of discussion. And I must say I don't know much about heritage either. What I am going to present this evening is a reflection on history, which will eventually lead to some considerations on heritage, or so to speak, on the contrast between the built heritage and historical legacy. It's not exactly the same thing. We will see that at the end. So let's begin with the idea that the current environmental crisis we are facing is often presented in terms of newness and novelty. The way we are degrading the environment, and especially climate, leads us to a future which will be radically different from our present. But the current situation is also the product of history. Choices were made and paths were followed that have led us where we are, and we can interrogate these choices. We can also say more broadly that issues regarding climate, energies, materials, and living beings are not new and have informed the past of our societies, including architecture. This is a project of what I call with colleagues the environmental history of architecture, to interrogate the past of our discipline in light of these concerns. And I just came back from a very interesting conference, the first of this size, of this topic, that took place in Iceland during the past week. And we discussed the various ways we can revise the history of architecture to make way for a better presence of environmental issues in it. And I have myself been exploring 2 episodes of this past that Alia mentioned, focusing on the history of solar energy in my PhD, and the history of air conditioning and fossil fuels extraction in the desert in my new project began at ETH Zurich last year. And this is what I'm going to explain very quickly, these 2 projects, beginning with the desert. So this first episode took place in the Sahara, the world's largest desert, whose western part was controlled by the French since the mid-19th century. The desert remained marginal in the French Empire until the aftermath of World War II, when it was seen as a potential resources provider to fuel the recovery and the modernization of France. The prospect for fossil fuels led to the discovery of major resources of oil and natural gas in the Algerian desert especially, 2 strategic resources in the unstable context of the Cold War, at a time when industrial societies were becoming increasingly dependent on fossil fuels. And to extract oil and natural gas, the French attempted to build settlements in the desert, often in collaboration with the military, at a time when the French presence was threatened by the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence in 1954. And a major research was undertaken to analyze the desert climate and develop strategies to adapt to it, involving meteorologists, climatologists, medical doctors, architects, engineers, and planners. And to develop designs to address the challenges of the desert, they developed these designs, not only the extreme thermal amplitude of the desert, with temperatures that reach 50 degrees Celsius during the day and drop below zero. They can drop below zero at night, but they also addressed the need to transport all the material required for the new settlements over hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers from the cities in mainland France or northern Algeria to the new settlements. Also beyond physiological and logistical requirements, there was a psychological challenge posed by the transplantation of Westerners in an environment radically different from mainland France, which caused various mental problems among these Westerners. So different types of buildings and settlements were developed to replace the first textile tents used by geologists, soldiers, and first workers of the oil companies. And the most commonly used of these building types was a prefabricated hut, a dwelling made of a single unit which could be transported by truck or plane across the desert and potentially be moved from a settlement to another. And to improve the living conditions of the workers, prefabricated huts often combine passive and active devices of cooling, like here, where the overhanging roof is meant to block the sun's rays, while the air conditioning units are placed below the windows. Various designers developed models of prefabricated air-conditioned huts, including famous designers like Yona Friedman, the promoter of self-organization and almost anarchist architect, developed unexpectedly designed this cabin Sahara, to house the workers of the oil industry right during the Algerian War of Independence. It used existing containers stacked on 2 floors and equipped with shading and natural ventilation devices. Jean Prouvé and Charlotte Perriand also designed air-conditioned prefabricated huts, this time in a much more sophisticated design, which combined 2 very small cabins, one for the day and the other for the night, both placed under overarching detached roof, supported by Prouvé's usual structures. The minimalism of the cabin, which allowed it to be easily transported, assembled and air-conditioned, thanks to its small volume of air to cool, this minimalism was counterbalanced by a luxury in the details. To provide comfort to the workers of the oil industry, Perriand designed pieces of furniture which combine all the equipment they could expect, from a kitchen, dining table, TV and laundry, all in a single element, to a bed, desk, wardrobe and bathroom in the night cabin. But soon, prefabricated huts were not enough and were not sufficient, and the French attempted to build whole cities in the desert. They were not only meant to house the growing number of oil workers, but also to install the French presence in the desert more firmly and permanently. An influential scheme was proposed to design these cities in the form of slabs of dwellings, placed on the periphery, enclosing a collective space placed under a roof and completely air-conditioned. It is this scheme. In this scheme, the cities also contained a broad range of collective programs and even pools and trees. Radical applications of this idea were proposed, including by utopian architect Paul Memon, with this design for a ville saharienne. It had the form of an inverted cone with housing stacked in wings to create a brise soleil on the exterior, with a collective space at the center. And the whole thing was meant to be powered by both a solar roof and a small nuclear reactor, which would provide permanent air conditioning for the whole settlement. And despite Memon's hopes, and we can note that he patented his design, confident in the idea that it could be developed and used by others, this idea was not realized. The cities built in the desert were less grandiose, although still in line with the previous recommendations. This is the case of Irara, built to house the workers exploiting the oil field of Hassim Saoud. Irara was composed of dwellings arranged on parallel lines, which were in fact prefabricated huts. These dwellings were completed by collective facilities regrouped around the main avenue, forming a monumental perspective towards the water tanks. This was a monument of Irara, this water tank. These collective facilities were meant to tackle the problems of social isolation encountered by the desert workers, but to solve the nostalgic syndrome felt by these Westerners transplanted to the desert, ecological engineering came to be explored. A tree nursery was created with intensive pumping in the deep underground water reserves, which ended up forming this forest. Plants and trees were to replace the infinite sand and rocks horizon, so the desert workers feel like in an environmental bubble, in a landscape close to what they were used to in a more temperate climate. This attempt to build extractive and you have these kind of gardens they try to create in this oil city. This attempt to build extractive settlements in the desert was stopped with the Algerian independence in 1962. The French had to gradually withdraw from the desert, while oil extraction continues to develop. But technologies and designs survived this episode. This was especially the case of solar energy, explored in the French context to directly fuel isolated settlements in the desert. A technology such as the trombe wall, using solar absorption on a glassed south facade to create heat, was developed to air-conditioned dwellings in the desert. Originally, it has a symmetrical device which could cool air using the effect of terrestrial radiation on north facades and roofs, as seen on the sections on the right. The trombe wall continued to be developed in mainland France, in the Pyrenees Mountains, where a series of experimental houses were built, such as this one, which would become the canonical version of the trombe wall. Architects also continue to explore the use of solar energy in the desert, this time in a post-colonial context. A young couple of architects, Georges and Jean-Marie Alexandrov, developed projects of solar villages and rural programs where they used solar panels to create mechanical force and pump water from the underground reserves. Their projects try to be attentive to the needs and aspirations of local populations of the Sahel. But they were the projects of the technical assistance the West was providing to decolonized countries, which was also a way to maintain their interest in these territories. This research on solar energy was amplified in the context of the oil crisis and the rise of environmentalism in the 70s, when fears over the past followed by industrial societies and the shortages of oil provoked a huge interest for solar energy, including in architecture, with many publications dedicated to this topic. Architects developed solar designs to heat buildings directly and to reduce their dependency on oil. For the partisans of passive devices, greatly influenced by the American counterculture, it was also a way to depart from the industry and all the centralized power that they proposed, this conventional way of producing energy and heating building, and the new way they wanted to develop. The adoption of solar devices was also seen as a way to develop a different relationship to the environment, where inhabitants would become aware of the climate in which they lived, where thermal sensations would enrich their experience, and where comfort would not only rely on fossil fuel or electricity, but a different kind of comfort would emerge. This is what argued brilliantly young architect Lisa Echong in her essay Thermal Delight in Architecture, translated into French for those who would be interested. And following this course, solar devices were integrated by architects in buildings, especially the trombe wall, which became one of the main bioclimatic devices used in the new eco-architecture. Here it was expanded on 2 floors of a south facade and combined with a greenhouse in this house built by the young American architect Douglas Kenbo in Princeton. Here as well in Switzerland, architect and ETH professor Willy Schaeffer became one of the main promoters of solar energy. He used trombe walls and other solar technologies in a series of houses like this one, where the warm air passes through the floors to heat the whole dwelling. And let's mention the other very popular device of solar architecture, namely the greenhouse, which was used not only as a heating device, but also as a living space, where inhabitants could become more aware of the climatic phenomena that they were experiencing and dealing with. And it was some years or decades before Lacaton and Vassal were actually educated in this context. And often devices and systems were combined, such as in the work of Françoise-Hélène Jourda and Gilles Perrodin, who explored the combination of inertia and lightness, of solar gains and shading devices, and of archaic construction and high-tech elements. Research was also undertaken to reread architecture's past in search for models of climate adaptation. Jean-Marie Alexandrov was particularly involved in this field, historicizing how vernacular architecture had developed in relation to the milieu in different climatic regions around the world, and explaining how industrialization and modern architecture introduced a break in this adaptation. She withdrawn many cases of vernacular types in her book, highlighting how climate, materials, use, cultures, and religions were closely intertwined in such buildings. Here, habitat in subtropical West Africa, where with a detached roof, so natural ventilation can reduce humidity, and the migration of uses between closed rooms and covered space, depending on the season, can happen. The long history of climate adaptation was eventually mixed with new concerns and new technologies, like in the work of Oswald Matthias Ungers, where a trombe wall and a greenhouse were integrated in a building which reproduced the canonical shape of the European house, an example of the short-lived ecological postmodernism, as I call it. But this research on solar energy declined brutally in the mid-80s. Many causes combined to provoke this decline, but the major one was the new accessibility to fossil fuels on the global scale, and in France, the domination of nuclear energy. Conventional buildings relied more and more on external energy to operate, with mechanical devices in charge of creating a perfectly steady and automated comfort without the comprehension of its users. And problems internal to solar architecture also emerged, as fiercely expressed in this drawing. New technologies revealed problematic or badly implemented, while solar aesthetic was sometimes questioned, to say the least. Solar architecture ended up being marginalized, and this episode was soon forgotten, if not despised. The built heritage left by this history is quite limited in scale, and often the buildings which remain are often difficult to understand today. They are a bit of a kind of enigma for us today to read. They look like curious experiments, and nothing tells us about the past from where they emerged, like Tromp experiments in the Pyrenees Mountains, appearing to us as solitary solar machines. In the desert as well, some of the buildings and urban designs born of this past are still present, but not considered as heritage. You see the city as the first development of Irara, which has been extended to this day. Built heritage is therefore not the main legacy of these historical episodes. However, this past, I argue, can inform the present situation, less by the buildings we have inherited from this past, and more by how it can enable us to frame and to think the current situation. And I will end by two concluding thoughts. The first is that we should acknowledge that part of our technologies and knowledge on climate adaptation comes from the colonial past. It is when colonizers try to settle in climates and milieux radically different from their mainland that they developed devices to adapt to these milieux. And the Saharan episode was just a late example of this, which have left us with tools that we still use today, and there are many more examples to explore. And the second and last thought is that the domination of fossil fuels, of nuclear energy, and the conception of buildings as dissipative structures was not the only path that industrial societies could follow. The history of solar energy shows that alternative trajectories existed for buildings to rely less on external energies to operate, and a closer relation to climate to develop. In that sense, the great acceleration conceptualized by environmental historians and scientists to describe the increasing degradation of the biosphere happening since World War II was not a fatality. But in the past, we have failed to make these alternatives and softer paths become realities. It then looks urgent to acknowledge that such energy transitions failed, and to look at the present situation in an informed and much needed critical view. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both presentations. part of them. I will start with a question for you, Turki and Abdulrahman. The work you've done with this research on Saudi modern architecture as a basis for highlighting the architectural quality of the building of this period and their need to be preserved was done at the same period of this massive demolition period. For which reason the government was demolishing at this moment? Because there were like very big new housing projects.
It was actually, do we need to use the microphone or could you all answer?
It was actually, the exhibition was done
A few months before the demolition, so it was purely by coincidence that we started we started archiving years before the exhibition. It just culminated almost organically or naturally into the exhibition itself. But shortly after the exhibition, which was supposed to be 20 days, ended up being extended to 6 months due to high demand. So we're very lucky. Yeah, the demolition is due to developments, but the nature of these developments are not yet clear. In some areas, they seem to be quite well defined, but the areas where they are well defined are not areas that were set for demolition. They were areas that didn't have any of these buildings. So the areas that were set for demolition don't have any defined. They're just, I don't know.
It's not a need of housing.
No.
Okay.
The problem that's maybe going on for, I think maybe the past 20 years, a lot of them are informal or branded as informal settlements. And the solution was to just remove them all wholesale and just rebuild everything. Former efforts to do more surgical interventions to uplift the neighborhoods seem to haven't been working that well. But there is also, and to understand better the context, it's also very highly influenced by the designation of the historical core of Jeddah as part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site and the plans to develop the area around it as a tourism destination. So, and majority of these neighborhoods are immediately surrounding the historic district. So these are prime areas for redevelopment.
And that's where this sort of are split between historical sort of heritage buildings and what is called modern buildings. And that's kind of where I think we're really trying to question what is the historical building? How do you kind of define history as being set in a very specific time? And how do you define history?
What defines it?
Yeah, what defines heritage and what defines history at a particular period in time? What's history in the 50s and what's history 100 years ago? Where does history start and where does it stop? And how do you define it by a particular material? How do you define it by a particular district, by an ethnicity that occupied it or an ethnicity that built it? And it's just a very interesting question, and I think it is quite interesting when you look at it from a social standpoint, architectural standpoint, historical standpoint, all these things.
And just for the second part of the question, when we discussed before this moment together, when we discussed about the phone, you told us that, and during your explanation, when you saw the house of the 50s where you had the exhibition and that was supposed to be demolished and then it wasn't, did you start a kind of a militant work with the authorities, for example, to try to make them look at all those buildings thanks to your work, your book, for the some that aren't demolished, maybe to look at them and maybe to preserve them? You see
I'll
consequence?
I'll happen very quickly actually, because
schedule for demolitions were issued, I think, 2 months before they started. So it was a very quick exercise of, what can we preserve? So we first were very ambitious. We were proposing saving entire markets, entire streets, mosques, schools, and over time, it's like you submit a document highlighting all of these areas, and then a week later you go and then the bulldozers are already there. So it ended up being a selection of buildings. Everyone who has the architects, historians who have been doing research on Jeddah have all come together to sort of come up with a compendium that was shared through the Ministry of Culture to the municipality, and then there was lobbying for keeping some of these buildings. So we ended up, with maybe somewhere between 3 or 4 buildings, maybe 15 buildings in certain districts. We were very hopeful. But I think the loss is that the urban grade is already gone. So even the buildings that we managed to preserve, there's still a question mark about that.
Just for, I wonder who owns the land. How can this happen? So demolitions are being so quickly. Is it because of private developers that develop new neighborhoods? Is it the state who decides this and can impose this kind of demolitions? Another question is, to what extent is it a broader concern? Are you a bit alone and isolated somehow, as voices trying to advocate for some consideration and preservation, or is there a broader awareness of the importance of this heritage?
I mean, we're a very small practice, so we do feel alone in a way, but there are a bunch of other practices that are doing that. There are a bunch of other architecture offices that are trying to do things that are similar, but again, it's just like what Victor was saying. You try to do as much as you can, but literally 2 days later there are bulldozers. I mean, it just happens so fast. On a more kind of positive note, because of the exhibition, because of similar efforts happening in different kind of adjacent cities, we are getting projects that are saying, hey, you guys are doing this, you guys know how to do this, you flipped modern houses, we want to keep these buildings, and we want to flip these into other projects. So we are kind of gaining that sort of reputation of we've got this proposal to tear it down, but we have these guys that know not to tear it down, so we're going to go to them and see what they can propose, just so we can see of how not to tear it down. So that's kind of something that I guess is something that's a positive turnaround, and in the past at least 2 years we have managed to save projects officially, managed to save things in the demolition sites, but also managed to get clients both at the governmental level and on the private sector as well to come up to us and say, listen, we were supposed to tear this down, but we know that you can work with something and make it into an interesting project without tearing it down. So that's something that's hopeful, and we hope that we can inspire other practices to do the same, and therefore we can not only save one building, but hopefully in the future can save entire districts. That's at least our wish. Thank you.
I would like to find a link between your two ongoing research, and there is one that came up to my mind. If we look at he used the second definition of the word heritage, which would be maybe the word inheritance or legacy. I'm wondering, and if we look at the work of Paul and his research in the Algerian desert and also architecture, can you tell me if you've identified any features in some of the buildings to study it or redesign or just visit. That could be rediscovered or restudied to meet future climate change challenges in Saudi Arabia. For example, the question of cross ventilation or passive ventilation or heat protection. Have you identified some of these features in those buildings from the 1938 till the end of the 50s?
I think, I mean, I think a lot of these buildings are relatively, I would say, they're not very smart buildings in that sense. I think that the real value there is the sort of the social sustainability aspect of how these neighborhoods emerged and how these buildings were used and occupied. I think that the type of the layouts of the houses that involve multi-family extended homes and also the distribution of living spaces didn't mean that you had to have AC running all around the house. Also because ACs were expensive at the time, so they had to be mindful of how to use these technologies. And I think that there is a lot to learn from that attitude towards new technologies, especially in a lot of buildings from that period. So I think that even though maybe there's not there aren't any passive cooling techniques or very distinct cross ventilation strategies, a lot of these buildings are actually very stuffy. But the way people were, commissioning projects and using the buildings really captures a moment where you had this generational dialogue between people who actually literally moved from the traditional vernacular core stone homes into a modern apartment block. So, and they carry with them a lot of sensibilities that are very sustainable in a way, that are not very easy to quantify, let's say.
I think, in a kind of sort of really off topic, but a parallel to Paul's research is what I can think about is in Mina, the pilgrims, the Mina area in Mecca. They built these pilgrim towns, which I think, until now, I don't think they've ever really acknowledged that it's anything that's relatively historical or recorded, how it progressed over time, have they?
When
I
did you
don't
do
know,
them?
Paul, if you have done research over that. I mean, I think it's since, I don't know, how long have they been doing it, and at least in a modernized way, because they are these tented structures that houses millions of pilgrims that come in, and they need to be properly ventilated, and they need to house people that come in from different parts of the world, and it needs to be properly organized. So it's really interesting, and it's people that need to go between the areas of Mina and Muzdalifah, and they're all part of the pilgrimage route. It's very well documented, but it's not really documented as something that's heritage or historical in that way, and in an architectural way, is it? There's only in the book.
I think, yeah, the Hydrogen Research Center was actually established in the 70s, and they've been working a lot with, because these are pop-up cities, because they have structures, during the 3 days of Hajj, and then people leave. So you go on these 3 days.
For a lot of people, it's probably.
I think, yeah, to like 2.5 million people.
It's literally a pop-up city for 3 weeks, which is quite interesting. It reminded me of the time you showed in Algeria.
There is, and I think in the 70s there was a sensibility of how do you find sustainable ways, and I think that's also maybe an interesting crossover. They had, they invited Kenzo Tange to do a proposal for the tents that was very, promoted cross ventilation and didn't rely so heavily on ACs. But I think now it's, I think now when you go into each tent of theirs, because you have maybe 12 people staying there and you have 3 ACs blasted, so
Yeah, it's so unsustainable. But I think that's a very interesting crossover. I don't know to what extent it's being researched now in terms of making it something that's extremely sustainable. I do know that there are people that have proposed so many things, but in terms of archival material, or at least contemporary archival material, I don't know if it's readily available. That's interesting.
Thank you. I have a question for you, and then maybe we can ask questions to each other. So I was wondering what sparked your interest in solar architecture, and how did you come to focus to the Algerian experience? And I'm wondering as well, how do you use this knowledge that you're gathering on those topics for your the history classes you're giving and all your activity into architecture schools?
Yes, thank you, Alia. How I came to these topics. Of course, these are research topics, so it's very tiny research, very much in details. This kind of experiments. But the thing which drove me to this is a kind of insatisfaction or lack. Maybe I was feeling as an architecture student because I was very much interested in history on the one side, and felt very much concerned by the environmental issues on the other side, and there was no connection between it. The history of architecture, as it was taught to us, had nothing to do with climate, energy, materials, and so on. And it was as if the architecture's past was deprived of this in a way. And I was feeling concerned by these environmental challenges. It was in the 2000s, in the 2010s, and I was lacking some examples, references, or broader understanding of these issues. And so I began this project to reread architecture's past in light of the environmental issues, and began researching this. The first concern, the first focus was on the 70s as a moment of great transformation as the architectural discipline at large. And there was, of course, the oil crisis, the rise of environmentalism, and gradually I kind of stepped back and looked back in the past, in the more distant past, and understood this kind of colonial emergence of research into air conditioning, into solar energy, at least in the French context, and the many connections between North and West Africa and mainland France. And this is why I came to this. And the connection to my current teachings, I teach a broader courses, like survey courses, so I don't teach my research only, but I try to reread the classical history of urbanism in light of not only environmental history, but also global history, for instance, and try to kind of update this narrative we have. And I also teach research, like I supervise a bachelor and master's thesis, and we explore with students in different ways to trace these environmental histories of architecture.
Thank you. And I have one last question for you. So you used the word before that I was not so sure in which what I know what it means, but I didn't really understand in which way you used it. You said that you used the word pastiche, talking about the Saudi heritage of earthen architecture, and I'm wondering why you used it, because in my comprehension, I really have no knowledge about Saudi architecture except those particular cities that are UNESCO World Heritage. And I'm wondering how they are considered by the authorities, how they are considered by the architects and by you in your practice, and do the features that were developed before oil don't have any interest in relooking at them to maybe transform them to a new project, new architecture. So is it something that you look at in your body of work, and why did you use this word of pastiche?
I think for me, I feel quite strongly about. I think because we're both kind of born in the 80s. For us, Jeddah architecture in general is kind of this more postmodern or modernist approach towards architecture, or this kind of development of histories. So looking at architecture from a very kind of pinhole perspective of it being this pastiche of architecture that's only defined as stuck in one moment of history is quite disturbing, to be honest. And when we sort of live in a particular place that's rebranding itself as something that as a place that's forward-looking, yet is always with every single project, whether it be something that's in the realm of arts or architecture or music or whatever it might be, we always kind of, and I think it's something that's more 21st century really. It's always about past, present, and future, and there's always kind of look at these things and how do we kind of redefine these things. But I think when you go to, and I think maybe because it's we're always challenged with these things, and I don't know, maybe you can cut me off whenever you can say something about it. But it's always past, present, and future, so we always have to look at the past in one particular way. Jeddah is coral stone and these very particular types of wood screen that's on buildings that are called Dawashin in Arabic. And in Riyadh, it's one brick building. And it's these very particular two types of architecture that define the entire peninsula, which is just untrue. There are so many different types of architectures that define the city itself. It's the urban green, it's the people, it's everything else. Architecture is not just what the building looks like from the outside. It's how the air passes through it. It's what's between the buildings. It's the civic spaces. It's the roads. It's the streets. It's everything about it that is not architecture. It's architecture without architecture itself, and it's architecture without architects. So it's buildings that are built in different ways, and how they sit up against each other and how they contrast each other. And I think that's something that's particularly interesting. And again, it just really becomes problematic when you start having these documents. It kind of reminds me of these BRIAM or LEED documents that tell you how to create a sustainable form of architecture, that you have to have to create, like to have a platinum building. You have to have a slanted roof or a sort of particular color of, and it's just becoming the same.
The label, the English label.
Yeah. So it's kind of becoming the same. A heritage building has to be that way, and that's the past, and then the future has to be an abstraction of that. It has to be brown because you're wood.
Okay. So the pastiche was to make building of today looking like the ones of the
Exactly.
in this sense.
When you restore it, it just looks like a Disneyland version of the past, but it's a UNESCO, and again, it's the UNESCO kind of guidelines to how to restore it. And every single time we go to a restored, at least a restored building back in the Jeddah historical town or in Riyadh, it's very badly finished. And it's just a bad restoration job and just looks like a new building that looks like it's just not an old building. So it's just, you just beg to differ, is that really a historical building or not? And could it have been a very bad restoration with a contemporary intervention that gave it, that kept adding layers of history onto it when just squatters went in and started using it and added layers of history onto it, which made it a much better used building than an empty UNESCO building that retained its kind of level of history for tourists to come in and pay money to see it. I don't know. That's what I think. Yeah, I feel very strongly about this. So
No,
I can keep going on forever.
No, it's interesting because I didn't understand in which way you use the word pastiche.
Yeah.
Now I understand. So for you, the pastiche is really like looking at those heritage building and just making new ones,
Yeah.
looking like the old one.
Yeah.
Yes, but I was referring to something else.
Yeah.
Like that you said. You said that there's lots of ways of looking at heritage. You
Yeah.
can look at devices. You can look at material. You can look at in between spaces.
Yeah, you can extract them in so many
Yes.
ways. Yeah.
I find this discussion interesting. It also relates to André Corboz because it's how each generation needs to decide what you have to look in the heritage. And I think that it was really looking on what you do. You really look at what you need for your own architecture, own production now. So you need to change what is really considered as like cast in stone heritage. And Paul, also you said you were frustrated in your, and now you look at this solar architecture that's is literally that is quite absent of the historic and heritage. And so it's more a comment than a question, but I find very interesting how you decide that now for your generation and for the architecture that you need today, you need this specific heritage.
No, this is true. Each generation needs its own historical narratives and references and looks at the past differently. We have seen this, of course, today, and I think also the definition of history and heritage differs and evolves, and this is what is at play in what you're showing, what you're working on, and this is really interesting. This is a kind of pioneering work that you are doing. It would also be interesting to compare it to other similar situations or locations. Are there other cities in Saudi Arabia and the neighboring country which have a different or similar relationship or reconsideration of heritage? I would be interested in knowing more.
Yes, definitely there is a lot of other practitioners and researchers who are doing similar work. I think one of the best books that was published in, I think it was 2020, is Cairo since 1900. So it's by a researcher, architect, Ahmed Shahid, and he did this kind of almost like a guidebook for exploring buildings in Cairo. And obviously Cairo was a much bigger city, so its modern architectural heritage is much more extensive than Jeddah's. Also, if you look at the Gulf region, there's been a lot of work being done in Kuwait and in Sharjah as well, and also in places like Beirut and Baghdad. But I think that in general, it still remains either marginalized in terms of current practice or kept, in the academic circles. So, and I think that we're really trying to sort of push that kind of thinking beyond, just these circles and actively engage with that heritage. So we also briefly mentioned that Saudi model not only focused on Jeddah, and our longer term plan that we're slowly building up is to also start to work with different architects from different cities, most of the major cities across the country, to sort of tell the story of modernization that happened in that particular place. And you see all of these, it's really bringing up a lot of these interesting kind of stories and how these cities evolved. And the more you look into it, the more you see that what is considered heritage has really become something that's, packed up, and the cities have expanded. So, take a city like Riyadh, the mud brick architecture was actually still, up until 3 years ago, was still being demolished to build modern buildings. And only now there is a few small collectives that are actively documenting, mapping them out, and saying, let's preserve these. And simultaneously, there are shopping centers that are the pastiche of looking like a traditional village. So I guess that really it's about how do we take action and how do we influence this in practice as well. And how do we, and this was kind of one of the outcomes for the exhibition. I think one of the main protagonists was actually the building itself. The building was saved from demolition, and it was being repurposed. But I also had questions for you as well, because I think that a lot of the solar architecture research that you've been doing is applied in cold environments in a European context. Have you encountered any projects that are doing the reverse, so looking at how these passive techniques are working in hot climates, or in Algeria?
Yes, thank you for the question. And yes, a bit paradoxically, at the beginning, or in the French context, solar energy was also research for hot and arid climate as a way to heat buildings, especially at night, when in the desert temperature could be very, very low. At some point, you can need heating. And it was also explored to produce mechanical force, not heat, not electricity, but force to pump water underground. And this was especially the case of the projects by Georges and Maria Alexandrov to equip villages in the Sahel with this water pump. And they used the panels, these solar panels, to kind of cover and house collective facilities and programs in these villages. So there were kind of different uses of solar energy in this hot and arid climate, but there are also other cooling devices that have been explored. Some using what was called in this theory terrestrial radiation. This is why the temperature can drop very, very low in the desert at night, because the Earth radiates energy towards the space, so objects cool down. And Trom and others were exploring the way buildings can radiate energy and produce cool air or cool water as well. And many more devices were tested in these propagated huts and cities. Some passive, some active. It was a major moment of the whole research on climate adaptation. So yes, there were all these kind of devices and proposals.
Maybe I'm going to ask you.
And the desert in Saudi Arabia doesn't get very cold, because, for example, in Algeria it can be 0 in January at night. You can drop from 0 at night and 20, 25 during the day.
Yeah, most part of the desert environments, that's the case. We're on the west coast, so it's just very humid and very hot all year round, day and night.
So they're not seasons.
Yes, very mild.
And does this is not really on heritage, but it's a personal question. Does the Saudi government is preparing the post oil and gas situation? For example, when there will be less oil and less gas, and that will be needs of alternative energies and maybe architecture that will not have all the energy to be cooled and.
I think that's in a lot of the future developments, and obviously, I think the most famous one is NEOM. That's the goal. And
NEOM, that's the goal.
that's the idea. Less dependency on that. And I think maybe the most convincing investment that's happening is in solar energy. So there are projects for large scale solar farms. But I think there are a lot of challenges, and I think that only in the past few years we've started to articulate these challenges and understand the need to take action. So you see that in a lot of the future development, but it's still slow in rolling out in everyday practice.
And until, do you know more or less until when, what is the 30, 40, 50 years, what is the amount of oil and gas that is available? We know that what is the, we don't know. Okay, but just to understand if this challenge is for in 20, 30, 40 years, because maybe we don't handle those problems when we know that we have for, I don't know, the next 60 years, so maybe you said, let's think about it.
No, but it's a lot of challenges, and I think one of the biggest challenges is also water, because in the 70s, there was a push to become self-sufficient in terms of agriculture, and that led to extracting, almost depleting our groundwater reserves, and now I think at this point we're at 90% dependency on desalinated water. So I think it is a very energy-intensive resource in the country, and there are a lot of challenges. And I think that really what's been happening in the past, especially in the past 5 years, is to even talk about diversifying the economy and acknowledging the limitation of this resource. Is already a big step.
Yeah.
Maybe there are questions in the public.
I have a question for you, Paul. In your research, there is a lot of kind of passive solar energy buildings that are directly embedded in the architecture. And I was wondering if the new solar panel fields in the landscape are part of the research or not. Thank you. Yes and no, somehow, because photovoltaics emerged or was developed on large scale. It started in the 1990s. Before it was researched and experimented, but the costs were too high, and the technology was not mature enough. So it was developed on large scale only. It has been developed on large scale only since the 1990s. So my research is before photovoltaics. In a way, all what was explored in a more integrated way, more thermal than photovoltaics. Yes, but I just wrote an article, and this connects to what you are saying on this. I was feeling a bit into, yes, I was feeling a bit shocked really, or hesitant, or questioned by this huge photovoltaics farms, power plants that are built in the desert, not in in Saudi Arabia, but in the Sahara. And I wrote an article on the idea of solar extractivism, and especially on a project which starts by explaining a project commissioned by big German companies that wanted to cover part of the Sahara with photovoltaic panels to export the energy towards Europe. And it was a way still to use the desert for Europe and to see the desert as an energy provider, regardless of the local population, the local environment, the need of the biosphere there. And so I question this kind of endeavors, contemporary endeavors. But they can be different if they are, well prepared with local communities, if they are not in this, following these schemes of transcontinental energy exchanges. It can be different, but it's sometimes I felt a bit skeptical in front of these images that we see appearing.
Thank you.
Maybe I had a question for you two about your strategy and your research on Jeddah. I don't know about Jeddah and urbanism, but I'm very fascinated to see it. And I was wondering which are the cities that you are investigating now, because I have a friend which was in Erbil and Baghdad a few times, and we talked a lot about how the urbanism now is growing there, from also very specific type of city, because Erbil is round-shaped form, which is really expanding, so it's quite impressive and it's going really fast. And now in Europe, we have really this phase of we don't have big projects now because we don't have space anymore and because we're thinking differently. But then I would like to know what is exactly your strategy that maybe you want to implement in the city, or to look at, maybe not the strategy you implement, but what you are looking for.
I think that we are experiencing a huge urban growth, and it's been going on for the past 50 years. So I think that the approach to start to limit growth is also starting to kick in, but also on the other hand, you have these new cities that are being built. And sometimes you say that, okay, these new cities are being built, but who will be living there? And we've seen examples over the past, in the past where cities were built and they are still almost empty until now. So there was a new industrial port that was built outside of Jeddah, like an hour and a half, called King Abdullah Economic City, which was inaugurated sometime in maybe 2010 or 2012, and it was a huge project, and it was being marketed everywhere. People were expected to go live there, work there, and now it's just becoming a weekend destination at best. Otherwise, a weekend destination and the industrial complex. So I think that urban expansion, there's always this kind of positive outlook and kind of taking the Dubai model of, you build it and they will come. But time and again we see that this is very, this is not what actually happens. So I think that at this point there is, on one hand, still this tradition is continuing and new cities are being built like New York, but on the other hand, there is more investment into the current urban centers and uplifting the urban fabric, introducing more smaller scale projects within cities to create better living conditions. And I think that, that if we take that even a step further, not looking at very flashy or, headline projects and look at, surgical interventions that make the day-to-day experience of our cities more sustainable and more, just more pleasurable, is something that we really hope to see. And I think that that's also something which, with the research that we've been doing, and with our kind of plea to stop buildings from being demolished, is that these are interesting neighborhoods that all you need is just invest in better paving, better infrastructure, and you will have very vibrant communities living there that really make this place unique. So that's kind of the aspiration, I guess.
Yeah, I think more and more we're finding ourselves in our practice not wanting to work on iconic projects. We just want to reuse buildings, as Turki was saying, these surgical interventions within the cities, within neighborhoods to make neighborhoods better. How can we make people's lives better? How can we make this corner of this small, tiny street better? So we're constantly trying to, in different ways, trying to meet owners of this particular building and trying to find out who owns this small little shop in this corner and that small kind of outdoor area, and how can we make that better? So trying to kind of go bottom up instead of going top down, I think is what we're finding our practice doing that, but also top down is giving us access to certain documents that can help us also to work bottom up as well. So it's kind of really trying to integrate all of these different things in our practice, but also trying to be really heavily involved as well in a more kind of academic manner. And that's what we're here for as well in EPFL. And we also try to attend crits, try to interact with students, try to do different parts of things. And, yeah.
You teach in Alia?
We try to attend lectures. We taught for a few years. We attend crits. You can see
with the practice there's
barely enough time, and with our interests in so many different things, it's so hard to be focused on one thing.
Because here in Switzerland, there's a very important movement on stop demolition.
Yeah.
There was an exhibition last year, and here students are really something they really are aware of, and so I'm wondering how is it for students in Arabia Saudi, this message you're bringing.
I mean, we're trying to boost it up as much as we can, and I think within that sort of undertone of what we have, I think that we're gaining a stronger voice, and more people are talking about it, and I think it's infiltrating a lot of different institutions, both from an educational standpoint, from rental, all of these different things. So we're having these conversations with so many different, in so many different ways.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's time to wrap up.
There is another question. Yeah. Thank you.